Welcome to the Neuroveda podcast for complex health. We feature guests who dive into the nuances of medicine with the goal of supporting you to heal across your lifespan. This is about ancient and cutting-edge understandings of diseases and treatments, just as much as it is about food, lifestyle, nature, culture, and politics. I'm Jillian Ehrlich, family nurse practitioner, certified in Ayurveda and functional medicine at our clinic, Neuroveda Health, Seattle, Washington. And we've got a pretty fantastic, I would say magnetic. I feel like you're pretty magnetic
Aw,
guest today.
thank you.
You're welcome. Whitney Mack, as a holistic health, hormones, and movement coach, Whitney Mack helps busy, driven women thrive in their bodies, reawaken their aliveness, and create a more purposeful way of living. Through her hormone-informed approach, she blends the science of female physiology with the sacredness of the body to help women achieve optimal health and well-being throughout all hormone and life seasons. If you're ready to heal your relationship with your body and unleash your feminine power, her signature method uses hormones as a compass to guide you back to your inner knowing and cultivate deeper self-awareness for sustainable transformation in less time and with lots of love. That's been my experience. Very true. Find
Aw,
Whitney, find Whitney through her website, whitneymack.com, Whitney, and Mack is Mack.com. Whitney, welcome. We're so happy to have you.
thank you. So excited to be with you.
Mhm. So let's start with like basics. I like starting with basics. So we're all kind of on the same track and headed the same direction. So let's just start with like what is fitness? And I'm asking because fitness has historically been described as, I think, like the capacity for certain types of exercise. Like my early 80s fitness brain is like leg warmers, which I still very much support, but like weird high-waisted leotards and tiny belts and Olivia Newton-John, like let's get physical. But what
Uh-huh.
is true fitness? Like, what are we getting fit for?
Yeah. Well, through my fitness certifications, there's sessions like five components of fitness, which is muscle strength, muscle endurance, cardiovascular capacity, flexibility, and body composition. They say that this makes up fitness. And I mean, all of those are important. All of those are involved in the programs that I do. And just think it's super interesting. Like, if you think back 100, 200 years ago, like, this wasn't a thing because we all, like, our lives, our jobs were moving. Like, 70% of the United States did agriculture, which is a very physical job. And, even historically before that, everything that we did used our bodies, right? Like all day long, we were using our bodies to grow food, to make things, to survive. And like exercise wasn't a thing. We didn't like go for runs or lift weights. And so I think this emergence of fitness has come from the fact that we don't move our bodies anymore. And
Mm,
so, in order to maintain a healthy level of muscle and a healthy level of activity, this industry was kind of born
yeah.
as a way to help people with that. And I think some parts of it are well intended, but slightly misled. Some parts are really great, but the core of it is really just like how much we can be moving our bodies on a basis. And if the only thing we're doing is setting aside like 30 to 60 minutes work out, I think we're kind of missing the point. And it's also important based on like how we lives. So
Yeah.
there's the definition of like those five components. For me, my whole process is really looking deeper at how to create a body that you feel great in and
Mhm.
love living in. And really, the more you move, more energy and vitality that you have as a whole.
Okay, fantastic. Okay. So like the insight I'm getting is like my perception of this like fitness industry in the 80s is actually accurate. So there was this kind of industry that has been created. And certainly now, it's even bigger and I mean, all of us are wearing like workout clothing and, those exercise pants and, tights and all this. So this was an industry that was essentially in reaction to the changes, how sedentary our lives have become.
Yep.
So what are those five again? Those five components again?
So it's muscle strength,
Uh-huh.
muscle endurance, which I think it's important to clarify the
Huh?
difference between those two,
Huh?
which I'll do in a second. And then cardiovascular capacity,
Hmm.
and then flexi, and then body composition.
Okay.
So there's a lot of confusion around like what actually builds strength and like
Mhm.
what muscle endurance is. And in order to build muscular strength, you have to have a heavy load that you are moving enough that it breaks down your muscles, and then you use protein to repair and you get more muscle mass. You build muscle mass, which equals strength. And whereas, so before I go into muscle endurance, like that's looking at like lower rep ranges.
Mhm.
So let's say like, you can do something for anywhere from like 1 to 6 to 8 reps, and you're doing high volume. So a large number of sets rounds. So for example, if I was going to do deadlifts and I did like 6 deadlifts for 5 different rounds, but that weight should be heavy enough that I can only do it for 6 reps. Like I could for 7, I couldn't do it for 8. And you're doing what's called progressive overload. So you're always trying to up your weights. And it's usually done in a cycle of like, I'm doing this program for let's say 4 weeks, and then I'm uplifting, I'm upping the weight that I'm doing. And that's the whole goal, is that you're always trying to lift heavier and the load is challenging.
Mhm.
Whereas muscle endurance is having a tension extended over a longer period of time. So that's like a higher rep range.
Mhm.
And so both are really important, both in your cardiovascular capacity in different ways as well. And then inside, like the vascular capacity, you've got the endurance, and then also like the shorter bursts, like high intensity interval training as well, which doesn't necessarily have to be like just cardio. What
Mhm.
we think of as like running or jumping, or it can be like actual strength based exercises or power based exercises woven into that. And so there's this spectrum of like short bursts or longer or cardio, and then there's the spectrum of like heavy weights versus lighter weights for a longer period of time.
Mhm. Great. Great. Okay, great. Okay, and then body comp and flexibility.
Yeah, flexibility has to do with the ability of your muscle to work through its full length and shortening.
Mhm.
And so, kind of inside that, which isn't named as, and like an emerging field, is mobility, which really means like full range of motion at your joints. And so, flexibility is the range of motion of your muscles.
Mhm.
So, a lot of people think of like stretching or yoga as working on flexibility, but flexibility and mobility kind of go hand in hand, because the shortness or tightness of your muscles can impede mobility. So, like if chest is really tight and it's pulling my shoulder joint forward, then it's going to limit my range of motion of like how high I can raise my arm, for example. And so, flexibility, the ability to lengthen the muscles, is going to impact the mobility of the joints, and you'll be able to have full range of motion of all your joints, ultimately also to have level of fitness, which is like another problem with a sedentary culture, is we develop these postural deviations with different tight muscles or with structural misalignments that impact flexibility, then impact your ability to work through full range of motions. And injury prevention is really like the flexibility mobility side to being able to get the most out of also like the strength and the endurance training too.
Great. Great.
And then body composition has to do with like your percentage of body fat too, and then the amount of muscle in your body.
Excellent. And so in our population, like a lot of our listeners, actually struggle with hypermobility. So we've got, or
Mm-hmm.
connective tissue disorders, where the tissue doesn't follow kind of traditional rules of movement or connection or stretching. And so um, I think that what's most relevant in this whole conversation with all of these parts is that customizing programs for individuals and then looking at how your body is responding. But there's not any one particular thing I'm hearing that you're like, You know, cardio is where it's at, or strength training is where it's at. There's a whole picture happening here. Is that right?
There's a whole picture, and muscle strength, I would say, is the most important of all of them.
Okay.
Because even with like when you're hypermobile, the goal is to build in stability, right? And understand like what a range of motion you want to be working in is that creates stability for your body versus like, oh, I have the capacity to move this big,
Huh?
but what, like, how am I actually building the strength around these joints to support them so that they're not moving in range of motions that create or allow me to go into this hyper mobility, right? Like stability is really important to create. And that's, you can do it through, muscle endurance training. That's that longer time under tension, more focused, and that higher rep. That's a good way to build a foundation.
Mhm.
And then, but muscle strength, its benefits extend far beyond um, even just your ability to be stable into regulating blood sugar and regulating metabolism. And so, like, the amount of muscle on your body really matters, especially as we age, if we're talking about like optimal and vibrant health.
Yeah. Yes. Yes, we are.
We're doing it.
We're doing it. So, talk to us about some of those other elements. Like, talk to us a little bit about the relationship between hormones and movement, and how do they talk to each other? What's that relationship?
Well, so as a woman,
Mhm.
we go through four major hormone cycles in our life. So when your hormones come online in puberty, I call it a transitory state. So it's like they're coming online, they're kind of all over the place a little bit. And when they stabilize and when your hips fully develop and your breasts fully develop, then you move into your cycling years, which is a longer and bigger phase. And then you've got perimenopause, which is another transitory state, which instead of your hormones winding up like puberty, they're winding down to get you to post-menopause, which is another longer hormone state. And so I call those your macro, your major seasons. But as a woman, if you have kids, you also go through these micro seasons of pregnancy and postpartum. So for me, for example, I've had two kids. And so throughout my lifetime, I'll move through the four major ones, but then also four because there's two for each kid. So like eight different hormone seasons that are impacting my body and what movement aligns to that because our hormones dictate whether we are in a what's called an anabolic state where we are primed to build muscle or whether we're in a catabolic state where the body is trying to shuffle nutrients and energy towards building the uterine lining. So it's called a breakdown state when it's catabolic, which isn't the best for building muscle,
Mm.
especially if there's like added stress during that time. So we have to be really mindful of stress when we're in our catabolic state versus the anabolic. And that's determined by our hormones and not just we think of our sex hormones like estrogen and progesterone and testosterone, but actually your queen hormones as a woman are cortisol and insulin. And so if those are dysregulated, it's also going to impact your ability to put on muscle and to repair, and also going to impact your blood sugar and your body's ability to regulate that insulin as well.
Okay, there's so much to talk about in what you just said.
I know. I'll let you sift out the questions.
All right, let's talk about and I'm not trying to be like contradictory or obstinate. So, but like why are cortisol and insulin the queen hormones? Why not estrogen and progesterone?
Well, so it works in a tiered system.
Mhm.
And so you never have dysregulation in the you have tier two hormones are DHEA and pregnenolone, which
Mhm.
are builder hormones for your sex hormones, which are or your tier three hormones, which are estrogen, progesterone, testosterone, melatonin, and your
Mhm.
thyroid hormones.
Hmm.
And the reason why cortisol and insulin are at the top are they're your survival hormones. So your
Mm.
body is going to prioritize your survival, and that's managed by cortisol and insulin and other stress hormones that you have too. And so when it comes to choosing between, am I going to sleep? Am I going to manage? How am I going to manage my energy with the thyroid? And am I in a state that is primed for bringing a baby into the world? It's going to down regulate all of those tier three hormones to prioritize your safety.
Fascinating.
So if someone comes to me and they're like, I know I have, you know, low estrogen or low progesterone or low, or my thyroid's out of whack, and they think that that's the place that you start, but
Mm.
really where you start is at the top. So the foundation is the same when we're talking about bringing your hormones into balance or creating optimal health from a physiological perspective. As we look at your stress, which
Mm.
comes, we're looking at lifestyle, we're looking at the way you move through the world, like how much is on your plate, we're looking at your sleep, how you're fueling your body. And then with insulin, that has to do with both how you're fueling your body, but also strength training and the muscle on your body as well, because that's going to impact how your body is using insulin.
Fascinating. And so, um, if we can kind of understand, like, there's been, I think, enough conversation about stress that we have a sense of like, there is a healthy amount of stress, just like you were saying. One of the first things you said was about um, working your muscles, using enough strength that your muscles actually do break down so that they can remodel, like that muscular
Mm-hmm.
remodel is so elemental.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Um, so if we think about stress as kind of like, okay, say we're in the zone, like how do we think about using our bodies or using fitness if we have this load of stress? How do we use our bodies in the right way regarding cortisol and insulin to kind of help stabilize us or keep us on track or support our muscle building? I'm asking
Yep.
kind of a vague question, but you're
I got you.
okay,
I
great.
got you. So, when we're selecting movement and when I'm working with a client or within, I have a online fitness platform called Workout Like a Woman. And if we're talking about the roadmap of how you choose your exercise, the first question that we look at is, what is your stress level? Because that's going to determine how much energy you have in the tank. And if you're like, exercise is a stress, and it's a positive stressor, and it can also push you over the top based on the type of exercise that you choose.
Mhm.
And also, like, the the other piece that makes like the perfect sandwich there is looking at how you're fueling your body. So we can add stress in a negative way if we are over exercising and under fueling, or even if we're just over exercising, or even if we're just under fueling, can add stress as well. And so if you came to me and you explained your life and we determined that you were operating in a pretty high stress state, the first thing I would do is just tell you to walk, like to walk regularly, like to get outside on a regular basis and walk multiple times a day. Then I would layer on some mobility work, some stretching, like opening up the body, and
Mhm.
then some strength training, but like low load and slow, like not trying to do anything like super fast or super intense, but you're operating maybe at like 50% of your capacity. So more like what we would do in the luteal phase of your cycle, and just prioritize moving your body, creating stability. I think movement personally is one of the biggest gifts to bring us back into our bodies and to really start to, one, build trust with ourselves again, of the listening of what do I need, and not just being like, oh, I hear that strength training is the best type of workout or HIIT is the best type of workout, so I'm going to do that. But like asking, what do I need today? And assessing, like, how did I sleep last night? And what is my stress load today? And what's happening for me? And determining the exercise from there. It really starts to build back that self trust and that listening so that we can also when symptoms come up, we can start to listen more to those and then follow that track of like, okay, what do I need? And so I think movement is one of the best places to begin that journey of self trust and listening. And because cortisol is a queen hormone, it begins with that first.
Mm.
And then if you're in a place in your life where you feel like, my stress is what you would call normal and
Mhm.
manageable and not over the top, then we can start to look at, okay, well, the next layer is looking at the macro hormone season that you're in. And
Mhm.
so puberty or your cycling years or perimenopause or postmenopause, because each of those, based on what your sex hormones are doing, but also how that changes the amount of cortisol and insulin that are being secreted as well. We pair exercise to match that.
Amazing. Can we talk a little bit about kind of how you pair exercise for those different
Mm-hmm,
cycles, those different
mm-hmm,
macro cycles?
mm-hmm,
Fantastic.
mm-hmm. So in puberty, if you think about what's happening for girls, our bodies are really changing and the way that our bodies move are changing. And so if before our hips widen and before we get breasts, we have a pretty narrow frame. Everything's kind of stacked right on top of each other, right? Like shoulders over hips over knees. And when the hips widen, it changes the angle from your hip to your knee,
Mm.
and then also changes the load that you're carrying on top based on, how big your breasts get as well. And so how your body moves through space and the distribution of weight and the angle of knee to hip to ankle all changes. And so we have to learn to move in this new body. And so for girls, it really is, and especially if they are playing sports, we have to teach them how to run, how to jump, how to do these basic things like squatting or even like shooting the basketball or like learning how to do your serve again in volleyball or swing the tennis ball, the tennis racket, and like how you stop in those positions so that you don't blow your knee out. And
Mhm.
so we see a lot of knee injuries for girls in sports when they're younger because they haven't been taught how to be in these bodies. And so
Mm.
it's really looking at slowing down, working on the form and the landing of all of these different exercises.
Mm.
And then we also want to stay with more of like the muscle endurance training of like really building stability versus layering on a bunch of weight before we know how to move in this body.
Mhm.
So the focus is on muscle endurance, building stability, like learning how to be in this body, which is not what a lot of young athletes are doing. There's a lot of like, oh, we got to get you in the gym and we got to get you stronger. And it really should be about like injury prevention and learning how to be in this body.
Yeah, that agility piece, I think figuring out, and I can see in, our boys who are friends, our boys, as, with my son who's now 9, every time he has a growth spurt, gets clumsy. And I can tell it's like he doesn't know how big his feet are. So he used to lift them this high to take a step, and now he has to lift them higher. But, you have to there's a point at which your lift was okay for a while and now you're tripping. And so he does a bunch
Mm-hmm.
of like it's very clumsy until he kind of figures out his new body. But I can imagine, I mean, obviously I was in this body as a woman and like I never really learned how to use it very well. And my hypermobility, I think, was also, I was never trained kind of how to use that. So as a young person, I really just avoided a lot of activity, or I did a lot of dance and gymnastics, which is like the
Mm-hmm.
the home for the hypermobile folks, and was really celebrated for my hypermobility. And when I started yoga when I was like 14, I was like, I am naturally amazing at this. And it took me until I was probably 24. I was doing yoga for probably 10 years before I had a really good yoga teacher who was like, why are you doing that? Stop that. Don't do that. Because I was hyperextending on my joints
Yep.
opposed to actually finding alignment. And so I was really blessed. I felt like early on to have somebody who really helped me with alignment. But I'm very much appreciating how we train young athletes is
Mm-hmm.
or the outcome of a sport versus the presence in their body and awareness in their body.
Yep. Yep. And also, There is a really big tendency now for overtraining that
Hmm.
isn't matched with proper sleep and nutrition, which is always like the other side of it.
Yes.
Because if you don't have time to recover,
Yes.
then your body actually can't absorb these changes and you're working towards the path of injury as well,
Yeah.
and so
Mm.
there's the balance of, like when I was in high school, would have like early morning practices,
Mhm.
right? But we know for like the physiology and the development of the body and optimal health, like what would actually be good for teenagers is to get extra sleep, like get a good breakfast, and then like do the activity like later in the day, right?
Yeah.
Like we can definitely get into overtraining if it's like, oh, I'm doing this practice in the morning and then I'm lifting after school and then I've got like this other practice, right? Like that it's not balanced with really good nutrition
Yeah.
and also good sleep and time in between movement
Yeah.
and exercise to be able to repair.
Yes. Yes. I feel like I'm like, sing it. Yes. It doesn't always happen in these podcasts. Like, I don't always feel like I want, I mean, a lot of the information that we talk about is like for, is science for health and for medicine. But I just, part of what we're talking about now is kind of our social construct as a society for how we train our young people in their bodies. And
Hmm.
um, when I was doing my clinicals, years ago at Madigan Army Base, I was talking to a PA, a physician's assistant who had been there 20 years, and he was saying that in the 20 years he'd been there, and this was, I think, in 2009, the 20 years before that, he'd seen more and more young recruits come in and get stress fractures from things that 20
Mm,
years ago, nobody, no kid, no young soldier got a stress fracture from, but this was carrying the same load that had been carried for, decades and decades and decades. And that with all of the video games and sedentary lives that kids are living now, not only are we not developing our muscular strength or our endurance or our capacity, but we're actually not even building our bones like we used to. So I think
yep.
that this is, um, like in some ways, this is probably one of the most like emergency oriented podcasts in terms of talking about our physical
Yeah.
that we've done.
Yeah.
So,
And I think for women and for girls, as we grow up, we are taught to tune out our bodies and to attune more to this external facing of what I should be doing, what I should look like, and we're not taught the phases our body goes through, how that impacts our mood, our energy, our physical capacity, how we feel in our bodies, how we relate to people, our communication, um, our social desires, like this whole spectrum.
mm,
And so when we're not taught it, and this is a huge piece of my work, is providing context for women so that they can change the what's wrong with me story.
yes.
Because when you don't know what's happening with your body, I feel like the one of the only ways for us to rationalize what's happening is, oh, there has to be something wrong with me.
Hmm. Hmm.
And so we go through our whole lives at war with our bodies and thinking something is wrong with us because we haven't been taught our natural and our physiological design.
Hmm.
And what I mean by that, our natural design is understanding how the our menstrual cycle mimics energetically the four seasons of the earth,
Hmm.
and it also mirrors the phases of the moon. And then inside our circadian, that's what you call your infradian rhythm, is any rhythm that's outside the circadian rhythm, which is what our menstrual cycle is. It's a rhythm that dictates so many physiological aspects of our body,
Hmm.
but it's whatever how long your menstrual cycle is. So if you have like a 29-day cycle or a 32-day cycle or a 27, that's your infradian rhythm. That is the primary driver of your physiology. And then the circadian rhythm is the sun's cycle, which
Hmm.
is your sleep wake cycle. That's the relationship between cortisol and melatonin.
Hmm.
They're synergistic dance together. And so we as women have these three things that drive our whole entire world and that we actually used to build our whole life around.
Mhm.
We would plant and harvest and plan based on the earth seasons, even the moon's phases, and our activity levels were determined by how much sun versus darkness we had. And so these cosmic cycles live inside us. They still influence us, but we no longer have to live by them anymore. They don't dictate the way that we do things. So we're so disconnected from them. And this understanding that like seasons are natural and that we move through them in this methodical way, that we can't just like take one out. Like you can't just take like spring out and think that you're going to have this amazing summer, or it can't just be summer all the time.
Mhm.
And so we are built with this natural design inside us. And then we're also built with this physiological design of our hormones and what they're doing. And when you're taught about it and you understand your body, you can start to build this relationship back of listening and trust, and then no longer have to wonder what's wrong with me, because you have the context of like what's happening and why and when and how.
Oh my God, fascinating. So this infradian rhythm,
Mm-hmm,
we haven't talked about that before in the show, so I'm going to spell it out. infradian. So
mm-hmm.
radian versus circadian. Talk to us a little bit more about kind of how do we think about, like, as I go through, if I'm listening to this show, how do I think about this infradian rhythm, or how do I think about my day moving forward?
So I learned the term infradian rhythm from Alyssa Vitti, and she is, I believe, she's like one of the OGs. She kind of made this idea of attuning your lifestyle, your food, your movement, your work, your parenting to
Hmm.
your menstrual cycle.
Hmm.
Um, like she was like one of the pioneers doing it like
Hmm.
20 years ago when nobody was talking about it. And so, um, before puberty, your main rhythm that drives your body is the circadian rhythm. And for women, when we go through puberty, our menstrual cycle becomes the determining cycle of our energy, of our moods, of the physical strengths, the mental gifts that we have, our moods, our capacity for whether we're doing more outward facing or inward facing work. It impacts heart rate, it impacts blood volume, it impacts strength, it impacts everything.
Hmm.
And the circadian rhythm becomes a secondary rhythm to that until we go through menopause, which menopause is your last period.
Hmm.
So we don't know about menopause until like 1 year in hindsight. And then once that period, if you've had that last period a year ago, then you're in post-menopause. So menopause is the name of the last period. Menarche is the name of the first period. So they both have names. Um, and I lost my train of thought when I went with that. Where were we?
So circadian
Oh,
comes
yes. Okay.
after
Yep.
postmenopause.
So you go back to a circadian rhythm as your primary rhythm in postmenopause.
Hmm.
But for those, for puberty, for your cycling years, for perimenopause, so really this like, if you're coming online, let's say at like 13 to like 53, it's like a 40-year time span that this infradian rhythm is the primary driver of all of your physiology. And for men and for boys, when their hormones come online and they go through puberty, their hormone cycle is still in alignment with the circadian rhythm. So their testosterone, the small amount of estrogen they produce, it's the same every single day. Whereas ours, to go through our full cycle of this infradian rhythm, it's however long your menstrual cycle is. So let's say, 29 days it takes us to go through this whole cycle, which is more mirroring the moon's cycle.
Mm.
So you can think of like how men's physiology is driven is more like the sun cycle. It's the same every day. It's predictable. So if we look on this linear timeline, they can count on if their health is optimal as well, like the same energy, the same productivity, the same moods, the same driving and motivations every single day.
Hmm.
Whereas women, ours is changing every single day throughout this 29-day cycle. And it's more like the phases of the moon. And so if you and I were to go out and look at the sky right now, and then we look at it tomorrow, and then we look at it the next day, we can't necessarily see the changes happening day by day. But if I look now and then I look a week from now, I'm like, oh, moon is an entirely different shape. And it's not exact, but really every week you're going to feel very significantly different over this month-ish long period as a woman during your cycling years.
Fascinating. I mean, and it's, I was a sailor before I was in healthcare. And so the tides around here are very much like, that the tide, like the high tide. So in Washington State in the Pacific Northwest, we've got two high tides and two low tides every day. And that each one moves by 50 minutes each day. So that the high
Mm-hmm.
tide is at noon today, it'll be 12:50 tomorrow, it'll be 1:40 the day after that. And so even though these cycles, and then there's also spring tides and neap tides, are what they called, for big exchanges of water versus lower exchanges of water based on the cycles of the moon and where the moon is in relation to the sun and the earth in terms of gravitational pull. And so it is such a fascinating, like, XYZ omega delta gamma, like it is like the number of dimensions that are involved in this are
Mm-hmm.
tremendous. And that's definitely, I think, what gives us women some of our magic.
I agree. I agree.
So how are you exercising, like, in
Oh, yeah.
like how are you
Cycling years, go
exercising
back to that.
cycling years, like your follicular phase versus your luteal phase versus
Yep.
ovulation, menstruation, like how do you gauge that?
So when your hormones stabilize into a predictable cycle,
Hmm?
then and let's call it a 28-day cycle. The average for women is 28 to 35 days these days. Um, and so we'll call it a 28-day cycle, and you've got four different hormone phases that you travel through for anyone who doesn't know. So your bleeding phase is the beginning. So the first day of your period, that's day one of your cycle. And then after your bleeding phase, you move into your follicular phase. Then you move into your ovulatory phase. And then last is your luteal phase. And so during each of these phases, your two primary sex hormones, estrogen and progesterone, which really are driving what's happening, which is really your body's just trying to ovulate. It's
Hmm.
like our culture is focused on the period being the thing, like your bleeding being the thing, but all of it happens because your body's ovulating or trying to ovulate and then trying to prepare a home for this egg that would be fertilized. And then when it doesn't happen, then we get the period. And so across these four hormone phases, your hormones, estrogen, progesterone, are doing different things. And so your energy levels, your mood, your physical capacity, your temperature, your blood volume, all of these change. And estrogen is a builder hormone. And when it is the dominant hormone, you're in an anabolic state, which means you're primed to build muscle and repair that muscle quickly, given you have enough protein in order to facilitate that repair.
Hmm.
And estrogen acts at the muscle protein synthesis site to build muscle. And then progesterone is what we call catabolic. So it's a breakdown hormone, and it's trying to um, divert all tissue and nutrients towards break down tissue and divert nutrients towards the uterine lining to build it. And so it's when we have estrogen as a dominant hormone, which is in our follicular and ovulatory phase. So that's right after bleeding through ovulation. You are more resilient to stress.
Mhm.
And so your stress capacity, we can call it your stress capacity, is higher. And also your insulin sensitivity is higher as well. And so this is the prime state for doing your heavier muscle training, your muscle strength training, and then also your high intensity interval training. So the exercises that cause more stress,
Mhm.
given that we are in a state that we're not, like we said, that cortisol is super high, then you're primed to do that more high intensity work. And so I like to work on what's called a scale of rate of perceived exertion. And during this time, you're really thinking of working at like 80 to 100% of your capacity
Mhm.
when you're exercising. And then after ovulation, your hormones drop off, estrogen drops off, and then we've got a rise of progesterone as the dominant hormone. And about halfway through the luteal phase, estrogen starts to come up again. And so you've got those two hormones. And so the luteal phase is really classified as a high hormone phase.
Mhm.
And during this time, our stress capacity is lower, meaning that it's just a higher stress state. Our immunity is suppressed, and we also lose some insulin sensitivity. And so for the first half of your cycle, the first half of the luteal phase, when progesterone is on the rise, we can still do strength training at like 50 to 70% capacity. So we dial it down a little bit, but we take out all of the high intensity stuff that would add more stress. And then in your late luteal phase, the time like 3 to 5 days before your period, that's when we peel off and we move more towards like muscle endurance, core, and flexibility training. And then in your bleeding phase, that's when you really want to think of like pouring energy into your body. So doing restorative practices that help increase blood circulation. So like yin yoga, self myofascial release, massage, acupuncture, sleeping. um,
Huh?
that you just really like, because your energy levels plummet and your hormone levels plummet, you want to think of giving energy back to your body as much as you can during that time. Walking, great too.
Great. Great. Okay, so those are how we do it in the month. And so, can you talk to us a little bit about the Workout Like a Woman, like your program and how it works and how
Mm-hmm.
yeah, tell us about that.
So I've got 3 different calendars in there. So for your cycling years, for perimenopause, and for postmenopause. And, in perimenopause, some things that happen are it's like it starts at 35 and goes through until, for the average woman is going through having their last period somewhere around 51.
Mhm.
And so that's like a 16-year span that your ovaries are slowly declining. So it's not like you hit 40 and all this stuff changes, or you hit 45 and all of it changes. Like it's a almost imperceptible decline to start.
Mhm.
Um, but as these hormones, as estrogen, progesterone start to fluctuate, and as other hormones are like follicle stimulating hormone is increasing to try to get ovulation to happen, it naturally adds stress to the body. And because it's adding stress to the body, so it's raised, your cortisol levels are higher. It's also going to raise insulin because it has to fuel this stress. And you also your insulin sensitivity decreases during that time. So it's kind of like what happens in the luteal phase that we have to attend to, where we need to be more careful about stress. But what helps improve all of those symptoms is having more muscle.
Mhm.
So strength training and really making sure we're working on that progressive overload where we're increasing the muscle mass on our body helps fight the natural processes of what women experience as like putting on more weight during that time, is by having more muscle on your body. And so in perimenopause, we want to have enough stimulation to the muscle that it creates change, but not so much stress that it pushes us over the top, because our stress capacity is naturally lower. or we have more stress going on in the body. So in perimenopause, instead of like in your cycling years where we would put the heavy strength training and the high intensity interval training together in the same phase, we are breaking those up and we're separating them.
Mm.
And so you have a time, like a 2-week block where you're doing the heavy strength training and more of the distance cardiovascular training. And then a period where you're doing more of the muscle endurance training, but then you're pairing it with the high intensity cardiovascular interval training. So there's enough stress throughout these 2-week blocks to stimulate the muscle, but not so much that it pushes you over the top into that higher stress state.
Mm.
And then in post-menopause, you get the green light to do a lot more heavier strength training and high intensity training, as long as you're fueling your body well. And so for In Workout Like a Woman, there's different exercise calendars as a guide of here's what exercises pair for this time, for this macro cycle. And so in the cycling years calendar, here are your exercises for the follicular phase and for the ovulatory and for the early luteal and the late luteal and for bleeding. And then in perimenopause, there's those 2 different 2-week blocks that we work with. And then in postmenopause, I base it off of the moon's cycle. And so what's great is like 3 weeks of strength training and then like a deload week. That's your natural recovery week, which during your cycling years, that's naturally built in. That's like your late luteal and bleeding phase. Your body knows that like it needs recovery and inward period. So I align that energetically with the week before the new moon, when the energy of the moon is darkening and it's more of an inward turning energy. That's when I put the deload week in the postmenopause calendar. So if you're a member, you log in, you go to the calendar, and all your workouts are laid out for you. And you can also just like pick and choose inside it too. You can search for different workouts, and every workout has a movement mantra that connects you to how you want to feel. So, for example, a movement mantra might be, I am grounded. So, the things that help us really dig into the energy of those different cycles that we move through. So like a higher energy cycle, a lower energy cycle, or even just the way that we want to feel in our bodies. I want to feel balanced. I want to feel grounded. I want to feel energized. I want to feel alive. I want to feel connected. And so you can also search based on how you want to feel and pick a workout based on that too.
Fantastic. Great. And just to reiterate, whitneymack.com is where you find out more about Workout Like a Woman. Great. And so let's say you're a woman who, let's say you're a listener, not even a woman. Let's just say you're a listener at this point for, this podcast, and you have not necessarily been active much in your life, or you've been active sporadically, or you've had a lot of injuries, or you have pain or hypermobility in your body, and you're kind of entering these perimenopausal years and finding yourself kind of struggling with this weight gain, struggling with energy, struggling with mood. How do you get started? Like, what is we talked about this a little bit in the beginning, and you said, the cortisol and insulin are really the places to start because those are survival. And you also mentioned like going for walks. But how do you start? What am I saying? How do you start with strength training? How do you start with exercise or fitness? Like, what is the first thing that you do, or how do you think about moving forward? Because there's not a lot of beginners classes, I feel like, or how do you start a progression? That's what I'm asking.
I would recommend mastering the major movement patterns. So learning how to hinge, which the most common exercise associated with that is a deadlift, and then squatting, and then pushing movements, like you can think of like a push up or like a chest press, pulling movements like rows or pullovers, your plank position, and really figuring out how to do those with good alignment. So it can be helpful to hire a trainer or look at things online. That's something that I do and work out like a woman is we work a lot on, there's a whole beginners, when you come in, there's a beginner's calendar that helps you build these foundations of understanding these movement patterns, because everything you do in terms of strength training is built off of those major movement patterns. Mm-hmm. So anything that you do with a weight, you first have to learn to do without the weight and understand like the postural alignment and what muscles to engage and where you want to feel it. And from there you build. So you should never be doing like a squat with weight until you've learned how to really do a body weight squat with good alignment, right? And so that's where I would start, is just learning like the foundations of strength training, of the basic movement patterns. And then once you have those, then you can start to layer on weight to it or different variations to it. But if you are someone who's never done it before, or you're not doing anything, I think the goal is just to start moving more. And we get so much benefit from just walking. And your body is going to be pretty stressed out already if you're sedentary. You know, the process of what happens metabolically in the body when we're sedentary, if you combine that with you aren't fueling your body well and you're not sleeping well, or you have a lot of stress in your life, the first thing that we want to do is figure out how to bring this stress down. So just as much as important as starting to move your body more is to really clean up your diet and start eating whole foods. For women as we age, the amount of protein that we eat is really important in order to both keep muscle on our body, keep bone density, get the nutrients that we need. And then, you know, cortisol's little queen is insulin. And so learning the ways like blood sugar hacks and how to balance your blood sugar is the other priority. And then sleep. Like I can't think of a single client who actually gets enough sleep. And when you're a mom, you know, it's like the biggest thing that I struggle with. It's because sometimes you can't control it with the kids, right? And so we got to look at like the controllable and the uncontrollable places of where we can manage your stress and then how we buffer that. So that's what I do a lot in my one-on-one work, is like looking at like what the actual picture of somebody's life is. What are the uncontrollable stressors, and how we can start to look at the controllables and really get like a strong foundation in those areas. Right. And exercise, you know, because of the fitness industry, lots of people think that the way you lose weight is through exercise. Yes. And there's so many benefits to putting on muscle. Like we've talked about, it's so important. But in terms of weight loss for women, and especially as we age, it all comes down to your stress picture. And that is like what's happening every day, not for these 30 minutes when you exercise. And so the female body will always prioritize safety. And the most energetically expensive is muscle. So it will eat away your muscle for energy and store fat because it's a more reliable fuel source. And so as women, when we are stressed and the body perceives that we are in survival mode, it's going to store fat. And this is where we see like, I'm doing the same thing, but like I'm putting on all this weight, is because your body is preparing for your survival and really trying to help you. So that's why the cortisol picture is more important. And then exercise, how we exercise really depends on what you have capacity for in your life too.
There's one of the changes that I've been making lately is to really spend more time outside, because I can tell, like I can feel how my cortisol shifting if I'm outside. And for me, being outside, you know, like my mom used to say, when you were little, I just treated you like a plant. And if you were moody, I put you in a window, which, you know, for me, being outside has always been a place of like relaxation for me. And so one of my like current sort of like exercise slash fitness slash balancing my weight slash everything sustainability as I'm coming into my 50th year this fall is really I've been spending more time outside, and I can feel things shifting as I make efforts to spend more time outside, like even on the grass, just laying on the grass in the yard.
Mm-hmm.
But just connected to the earth as opposed to sedentary staring at a screen, where there's no rhythm. You know what I mean?
Yep.
And I worked for years as a nurse practitioner in small rooms with no windows, small offices with no windows, like over a decade, small office, no windows. And so there's no connection to what's happening. And I think I part of what I'm taking from our show today is really how much for women it's every day is different, 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 different. And
Mm-hmm.
that's built into our makeup. It's not that our mood is shifting or we're like unstable. It's that it is our rhythm for us is going to be a really powerful way that we anchor and ground into ourselves, and that we're also how we're structured. So to argue with it is not going to get you anywhere.
Yeah. And, the female body is so amazing. Like, I am in such deep devotion and reverence to the female body. And when we don't understand the cycles and seasons that she goes through,
Mhm.
we can't support her. We can't support ourselves in a way that creates optimal health on all levels. And so, what our body does as a response is she shows us different symptoms,
Mhm.
present symptoms to say, like, hey, girl, like, this isn't working.
Yeah.
And because we haven't been taught that, even for example, like premenstrual symptoms, which are super common,
Mhm.
they actually aren't normal, especially in terms of um, the degree to which women are experiencing them, the extremeness to which they are experiencing them. And so your cycle is basically like a report card every month telling you how much in alignment you're living with these different cycles. And we've been taught to, put a pill on it, put a birth control pill on it, or take Advil, or even just we're dismissed and told, like, sorry, that's just a normal experience of being a woman. But
Mhm.
it's really the way that you can start to build deeper trust with your body again is listening to those symptoms, seeking the root cause of those symptoms, which always has to do with that, the tiered system of your hormones and like other, if we're looking deeper into like gut health or liver health or things like that, they're all driven, like, they're driving up stress as well, right? Like when your liver isn't functioning well, when your gut isn't functioning well, that's driving stress and inflammation up in your body. And so
Mhm.
again, you're looking at the level of stress and all the places that it's coming from, and then decreasing that is going to pull us out of that survival mode and into deeper, more optimal health. And so when we understand the cycles and then we start listening and we understand that it's a blueprint that our body's like actually trying to work with us instead of being our enemy, like, it just completely frames the way we can reframes the way we can exist with our bodies.
And so if we are people who are in need of hormonal contraception, where, we are going to exogenally regulate or change those cycles. Do you have any thoughts or advice about how to like stay connected to rhythm?
So anytime that we don't have our menstrual cycle,
Mhm.
we as women are more impacted by the moon's energy.
Mm.
And so if you think about, like, the moon can literally move the ocean tides, and
Uh-huh.
our earth is 70% water,
Mhm.
and so are our bodies.
Mhm.
And our menstrual cycles, before we had light and heat that manipulated our ability to know the seasons and the times and when it was dark and when it was light, there's a lot of evidence that shows that we cycled with the moon, that we ovulated on the full moon, that we bled with the new moon. And we really like perfectly mirrored this cycle. And there were rituals and practices in all cultures based on honoring these times. And so that if you attune to the moon cycle, and it's natural from like, so the beginning of a new moon cycle is the new moon,
Mm-hmm.
and its energy, its light is building up until the full moon. And so that's just like the follicular and ovulatory phase of your menstrual cycle, that you have this energy that's building to this peak that's ovulation. That's the same as the full moon. And then you have this slow waning of energy and the shift inward all the way down through the waning moon phases down to the dark moon is the last moon phase before the new moon. And that's really energetically like our PMS time, where everything it's like it like feels like we're in the dark, and then we get our period and we're like, oh, that's what was going on. And it really feels like that with
Uh-huh.
the moon too. So to be connected to that cycle, be connected to the earth cycles, and honoring like the bigger seasons inside these micro seasons of the moon, um, is what I recommend for any woman who's not cycling, whether it's because of pregnancy or because it's induced by, you know, an IUD or by birth control or whatever it is. Because we are cyclical beings. That's
Mm-hmm.
how we're designed, and staying connected to that. And even if it just helps us attune to listening to how we feel
Yes.
better,
Yeah.
that's the most important thing. Like, oh, I'm waking up and I don't feel great. I don't feel like I rested well. And so like even that listening
Mm-hmm.
is what's most important, and understanding like we're not supposed to be the same every single day as women, whereas that is a deep expectation in our society, because our society is attuned to the circadian rhythm, which also happens to match the male hormone cycle. This idea like the sun comes up, goes through the same cycle every single day. So we should have the same energy, do the same things, and we're just not, our bodies just aren't attuned that way.
Yeah.
And when we do build our lives around that cycle, then we say, what's wrong with me? That I don't feel motivated to do this today, that
I
I
am not
don't
in
feel like
step.
hanging out with this person, that I, would rather do this than this.
Mhm. Yes. Yes. And you're exactly right. Our economic system is also set up for like out of the Industrial Revolution, where it is you're on the line making your widget day after day after day, and there's no rhythm to that. You just make your widgets and then you go home and then you come in and make your widgets. And so that production oriented does not really allow for cyclical rhythmic sort of engagement as well.
Yep.
So okay, so I want to like see where we're at right now. So what we've talked about is that we as women have this infradian rhythm that is beyond the
Mm-hmm.
rhythm that we cycle through every day, along with them as the moon changes, and we cycle across our lifespan with these four stages of
Mm-hmm.
puberty, kind of cycling, stable cycling, perimenopause, and postmenopausal time. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and we've talked about how cortisol and insulin really are those queen hormones, that foundation, the top and the bottom. They kind of encapsulate everything else. And that even if we're using some level of hormonal contraception, like a birth control pill or an IUD or something that's regulating our estrogen and progesterone levels, exogenously, meaning from the outside, that there are ways for us to stay connected within this rhythm of the moon, especially within our cortisol and insulin, and that those are using the cortisol and insulin, using our nutrition, using our sleep, and using our movement are ways that we can establish rhythm so that we stay connected to ourselves, so that we can both listen to ourselves as well as know how to respond to take care of ourselves
Mm-hmm.
across the lifespan.
Yep.
Did I get
Love it.
it?
Mm-hmm.
So anything else? And, I just want to put in another plug because I think your programs are great.
Oh, thank
So,
you.
if you're wanting to actually implement this in your life, whitneymack.com is for the program for Workout Like a Woman. Okay, so we're about at time. Um,
Mm-hmm.
I want to I want to ask you, like, is there anything else you want to add? Anything else that we haven't touched on that we should cover as, to kind of tell this full story?
Well, I think when you first get into hormones, it
Mhm.
can be like, and especially when you don't have anything to look at, like I usually map out a lot of stuff we talked about on paper so you can see the different cycles that we're talking about. You can see the connections that they make and how it all is the same pattern over and over again, whether you're talking about the earth cycle, the moon cycle, the sun cycle, your menstrual cycle, these macro hormone seasons you travel through. It's all this same energy that's at play over and over and over again. And you and I could sit and do a podcast just about puberty, just about cycling years, just about perimenopause, just about postmenopause, and so we covered a lot of, we covered the whole spectrum today, kind of a
Huh?
broad way. And so if it's like, if you feel overwhelmed at all,
Mhm.
that I can also send you like some books that are great to dig in, depending on like what
Oh,
phase a woman is in. But it just takes, I think it's important to learn about where you're at first. If you're in your cycling years, like understand that. And then from there, move to like, oh, then I'm going to learn about perimenopause, like what's coming and how I can support that, or postmenopause, because in our podcast, we can't cover everything that we should have been taught in sex ed and from our mothers, and that should have been talked about within our women's circles and our friends for our entire lifetime,
mhm.
And so I hope that there were some like aha moments for people who listen of just like, oh, I've never heard that before. And so like follow that thread of interest of like,
Mhm.
oh, that was a thing that I think could make a big difference for me. I've never heard that, instead of trying to like comprehend everything that we talked about today.
Mhm.
And because I believe so strongly also in the power of curiosity and following your own intuition and what you're drawn to. And the whole point of understanding your natural and physiological design from the perspective I teach it is just to tune you back in to your body and so you become the one that you're checking in with, and you're saying like, oh, does that feel right, or does this feel good when I'm doing this, or what do I think that I need, because those questions are ones that we just haven't been taught to
Yeah.
ask. And
Yes.
it's a filter that I encourage even when I'm teaching and I teach on a concept. I always will talk to a client about like, how does that feel to you? And like,
Mhm.
what do you think about that? Because I don't want to be someone who's just delivering this information as a like another black and white thing.
Mhm.
There's nuance even inside of everything that we talked about. And so I believe that women, we are the experts of our own body. We need information we haven't been given to listen better. But it really just comes down to listening and curiosity. And that's how we build back that trust, which is just the most important thing.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Perfect. That caps it. That's great. Thank you.
Yep.
Thank you for being here with us. I really appreciate it. I think that this is great information. And and in terms of approach, we've done some other shows. There's an OBGYN we did a show with, and I'm trying to remember her line, but her like whole business is called like There's Nothing Wrong with You. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
but I think what we did today that I really liked is diving down into why we think there is something wrong with us. Um,
Yep.
and
Yep.
so super
We've
helpful.
been we've been trying to be the sun our whole lives when we're the moon.
And we're the moon. We're the moon, baby.
Mm-hmm.
Great. Great. All right. Well, thank you for being here
Thank
with us,
you.
Whitney. And thank you, audience. Thank you, our listeners. We love that you've joined us today to discuss how to make our whole world medicine. And we really talked about that today, like the moon, the sun, the stars, the cycles, the seasons, time. We rise or fall together and are committed to sharing knowledge and insight that empower us and our communities towards greater health. Thank you for listening to the Nerveda podcast for complex health. We will see you next time.